start that recording there. And it usually takes us about, 30 minutes to get the recordings and the actual session decks up if you weren't able to attend the calls in the past. So just bear with us after each of the sessions. One of the housekeeping items I wanted to reiterate that we didn't get a chance to on our last governance call really go into that much in depth was just a call around if there was anyone interested in kind of playing, basically we're calling it like a secretariat role. Effectively, when we started to look at our processes in the new year, we wanted to have some kind of transparency and continuity for folks who weren't able to attend, which is part of the reason we started recording the calls and uploading our content on the OwnCloud. But I know that there are a lot of folks who can't join regularly and that use the InfoCentral forums as a means of essentially staying up to date on what we're actively working on, any of the decisions that have been made, or any of the kind of key action items. When we talked about this kind of idea of kind of having someone playing that role, or a number of someone's playing that role, the idea was basically a recording of attendance, a recording of any major discussion or decision points, but it was kind of bullet form, so as not to overwhelm or inundate folks. So I'm curious, based on how you're interacting with our content, how your colleagues are interacting with our content, is there an interest in kind of reassessing whether or not we need that extra step of, putting those bullets in the form of, the forum post afterwards? And is there anyone interested in facilitating? You don't have to sign up for every single one, but it can be helpful if we get kind of some of that feedback loop going on the forums, because not everybody goes into their own cloud. So what if
I think
it's important at this stage?
is useful. I think if we can find someone that's useful. I'm not sure we can find someone, but if we can, I think it's useful.
Is there anyone interested in at least trying it out on a no committal basis, effectively just capturing attendees at some middle point, and any kind of, the nice thing about it is the discussion points, we typically lay them out in the agenda, so it doesn't require a lot of kind of working out beyond that, but capturing any specific kind of action items or decision points.
I shared this page, so means I cannot commit for all the sessions, but as and when means I can make notes of the decision points as a key discussion topic, if that will work. So
yeah, that would be really helpful. And like I said, it's no commitment. Let's just see if it works, if we're getting value from it. And it's just a post to the forum kind of following the calls. Because typically what Mike will do is he'll post, here's our agenda ahead of the call. And it's just, here were any of the topics or decision that were made.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for volunteering, Mukesh. I appreciate it. I mean, I think let's trial it out, see what works. And then when we, maybe what we'll do is we'll ask for just at the beginning of our governance calls, if there's that level of interest, and that way it's not always falling to the same person. If somebody, especially if someone's not present, does that seem like a good process to trial this out?
Yeah, my impression so far was okay, as this is being recorded, so things are already there, but yeah, definitely we can do it.
Perfect. I really appreciate that. So the next piece on the agenda is just because it has been, I think it's been about 3 weeks since we last met. A lot's happened. There's been, a number of conferences, a lot of good work in this space. When we last met on governance, we started to dig into that next step we had highlighted of, trying to make the specifications that we do have, that our current state that we have to work with, more usable, and digging a little bit more into what that means from a leaning more into use case agnosticism perspective. So I want to just give a quick recap for folks that either it's been a while or you weren't on our last call. But one of the things that we wanted to do is to figure out what that process would look like if we wanted to incorporate more use case agnosticism that would make it easier for folks to kind of leverage what's in place moving forward. And one of the kind of first preliminary steps that we took is we looked at what some of the other national bases look like, so that we could see, like, how are we comparing and what are the types of decisions, can we categorize the types of decisions we've made, with ultimately the goal being, talking through, do we change our process right now, which is really focused on, we called it a due diligence review, which is change things as things come up, as we see them come up in implementation guides that are in FHIR in Canada, and remove when we find that something isn't present. But I think it's a good, like, pivotal point for determining, like, do we need to augment that? Because even though that's been what our process has been to date, we still don't quite look like our peers. And it may make sense to try to figure out what extra step in the process that we should be considering. So I think that's really the big bolus of the agenda that we had today. I wanted to just open it up before we dig in and do that little bit of a recap first. Anything else that folks want to make sure we leave some time on the agenda for?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Ron, go ahead.
No, Lorraine, you go ahead.
Okay, so when Joel and Attila presented the roadmap to us, they also gave us a rough indication and an org chart for what Infoway saw as the governance structure going forward. So I think a discussion of how we fit into that might be useful.
So this is largely for the roadmap activities, not for the CA core.
Well, this is the governance call, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So they sent a governance org chart. How do we fit into that governance org chart?
Okay, we fit in. And so is your topic more of like a question for the Infoway folks, or is it more of like, how do we see ourselves? How would you like this to be tackled in the agenda?
Well, I think it's how we see ourselves, although I don't know if we have any control, but
I think it's a great idea to discuss this a bit, and then also if we think we've got something meaningful there, to assert it, because I definitely had the sense when that was presented that was just a working piece of, just a starting piece of work, and that we had an opportunity to comment. So
yeah, so if we have feedback or comment how we see ourselves fitting in, that kind of stuff.
And that doesn't have to happen today, but it would be a really good thing to occur.
Yeah, and we might sort of start the conversation by looking at what they presented to us in the HL7 Canada call, and then think about, give the group some time to think and come back with feedback.
So maybe like a two-parter initial.
But I do think that it's a pertinent topic given
with collecting feedback at the next governance call.
I mean, given, we're ostensibly dealing with governance here, and let's make sure that we're fitting in with the overall plan.
Yeah, I think it would just like what I will say is, like, I think if this is a very high, we'll have to see, right? Like, I think the idea is if it's covering over governance at large, it's going to go to topics that are broader than just FHIR profiling, FHIR activities in Canada, right? Because it's more than just the specifications that are being produced for FHIR exchange. So I think as long as we can provide, like, we can operate under that lens.
I think our scope here is more than just the FHIR profiles when we're talking about how we're governing FHIR within the community.
Yes, as an exchange standard. Yeah, I think the point I'm making is just like, I think when we get through this, and maybe do we think we'll need like 15 minutes at the end for this initial reaction, so that like folks at least have something that they've seen if they weren't participating in the HL7 Canada Council, and then really more focused feedback at the next governance call. should we look at saving about 15, 20?
Sure, that works.
Okay, can I have you just keeping an eye on the time and just like giving that reminder at the 40 mark?
Sure.
Perfect. And then Ron, was that your comment as well?
No, I had a different comment actually, and not, I don't think for today, but we can put it on a future agenda. It's, I've been learning a lot about the principles behind participating in an SDO and what the obligations of that are. And this is mostly through some activity at HL7 that's been happening, and in conversations with Karen Van Hentenrex, who owns the responsibility we have with ANSI. So it turns out there's an ANSI requirements for due diligence, and there's also HL7 ANSI essentials document. And I would like to actually show that to people to give them a sense of what constitutes appropriate and effective due diligence on the part of any organization that is building, or for that matter, localizing standards as their own standards.
So this would be like a special, not a special session, but it's going to be more informative.
Yes, it's mostly informative, but I'm just really interested in what people see. And it turns out, and I've hinted at this in the past, and I've always believed this in terms of my own reading, but I actually asked Karen to talk to ANSI directly about it, and everything they said validated the assumptions I was making, which was interesting. And the path towards that, really, believe it or not, right down to working groups, starts with the World Trade Organization, and how standards accreditation organizations that exist at a national level relate to standards development organizations that actually do the work. And it's interesting. Anyway, I find it interesting, but it might be helpful for us to understand that as well.
Yeah,
So-
which is why I mentioned that we needed to look at essential requirements as well as the GOM.
Yeah.
So that will be June 9th at our next, question being two-part. Is it June 9th? Is it that like you want to have it at the next one, or would it be like sometime in the next month? Because I know I think I may be the only one that's at Dev Days. I don't know. Anyone pipe up if there are others that are joining this year.
I'm going to be time shifting virtually
Yep.
for Dev Days.
Yeah. So
And
Deb,
Ron, didn't you say you were going to be in Amsterdam that week too?
I'm not. I had hoped to be in Amsterdam on the Friday, the 2nd, but I can't be. I can't make that work. So
It's Friday the 9th.
yeah, so the 9th is fine. If are you, is that the meeting in Amsterdam, is it Dev Days then on
Yep.
the 9th?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, no, I would prefer not to do it then. I would prefer to do it on the next pass.
So then that would be, if we're following our sequence, the 23rd.
Okay.
And then is it something?
I
Sorry.
don't think there's urgency to this. I think it's
No,
just
there isn't. It's just informative, but I
Yeah.
thought, given what we're attempting to do here and our feeling, because really what this does is this whole due diligence process is what gives the sense of authority to things that are determined as standards. It's fundamental to that. And we've talked a bit about that before, but anyway, it's just an interesting correlation of these things.
And then did you say, Ron, you're comfortable presenting on it? Or do you set another name?
Oh, no, I'll present on it. No problem.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll put you down, like, let's say, like, potentially we'll do another check-in at the next
Sure.
governance call as well. But it is helpful to kind of, when figuring out what the next couple agendas will look like, to get something slotted.
Sounds good.
Beautiful. Okay. All right. So going into kind of our first agenda topic, I'm just doing a very, very quick recap. So part of our past governance calls, I think, when we were going through the process of trying to understand how we would recommend relations to other guides domestically and internationally, we talked a lot about this idea of true use case agnosticism, right? And that we don't want guides and profiles to be duplicative of each other. And so, like, having bases that are kind of truly expected to be derived from, but to not be duplicated across multiple sources is important. And that, like, not having this kind of use case agnostic not methodology, but like not meeting that bar creates challenges later on with folks being able to actually leverage them. And also creates additional places where, as we mature more and more, will be resulting changes if we continue with our intent of kind of being use case agnostic. And so what we looked at last time was effectively just like a quick scan through a handful of like the Australian, the New Zealand, the UK, the Danish, and then our comparison of our own. We did an apples to apples comparison of the condition profile to see what types of constraints that we could see amongst our peers, and to try to look at what the differences were in gauging, you know, how far we are from some of those modeling behaviors. And so we spent a good deal of the last session actually going through this. Just pulled up some of the snippets on condition for folks that weren't present. But the things that we really started to hone in on were like behaviors and modeling choices that we've made around, data types and conditional cardinality, this use of must support. We looked at how people used extensions, how people were dealing with bindings, both in the types of things they bound to and the strengths, and, tried to assess and start the conversation around, are there places where we think we might have missed the mark? Or now that we have a larger reference group to go off of. And so I pulled out the questions that we started to kind of work through last time. We really just very briefly touched on like a couple like use cases. We used that kind of, I think it was that condition example. And even through that process came up with a number of use cases where like some of the must supports that we've applied may not make sense, that may not be identified in our implementation guides in the Canadian Fire Registry today, but nonetheless will need to be represented in FHIR in the future and need to be considered. And so the idea was, can we kind of try to identify where we're missing the mark and where we should set the target based off of these places where we've made constraints and rules and expectations in the past. And so, like, I know, Lorraine, you mentioned, like, when we started talking a little bit must support, just some evidence in the past where, we did have to go through a number of cycles where we looked at practitioner and practitioner role, and places where, BC guides had raised must support had been applied and was kind of too strong for the general and registry use cases. I think the way we kind of arrive at a target is hopefully to go through kind of each of these areas and saying, like, are there actually places that we think, we'll just never be challenged by use cases? Like, these are types of rules and expectations that we both haven't encountered as not present in guides, and that we could anticipate would be safe to make because they are free of that potential. And so, like, I want to go back to the must support discussion, because we had some back and forth last time around the challenges that must support presents, as well as the benefits and how we balance those things, right? I think it was, Randy, was it your comment about, like, if we don't have must supports and we really don't have a lot of other constraints, like, what do our profiles provide? Because right now, that's one of the ways that we influence the author community. But I think it has to be balanced against some of the challenges that we've experienced around how folks utilize must support in their guide. So in thinking upon it, like, are there places we think, like, talking about patient or condition or whatever example you want to provide, where you think, I would never worry about a must support being challenged by a use case?
If I may, one of the very useful techniques I've used in these kinds of situations in the past, not just for standard, but other things, particularly around architecture, is the concept of considerations for must support, where if you have to provide optionality, you will still give people an option where they think it may be necessary to be used, but you provide some of the things they should consider before changing that.
Is that like a section you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So considerations for must support as a section in the the baseline guide. Yeah. I think that would be incredibly helpful. People can then make informed decisions about the choices that they make.
Lorraine, I see your hand up.
Well, Ron, if we mark something must support, that means that implementers actually have to write code to support it, whether they use it or not.
Whether they use it or not. Well, I understand.
So
Okay, so that would be, okay, never mind. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So one of the questions I have is, and this came up in another broader Canadian meeting this week, is we really need to think about whether our requirements are different from the base requirements or not. And when is it appropriate for us to create more constrained profiles?
Yeah.
Because if we don't need to do a CA version, we probably shouldn't.
And you're referring
Right.
to the FHIR base, right? Like the resources that we have to work with.
The resources in the FHIR core.
Yeah.
The only time we should be different is if we need to be different. And the same thing happens with, whether we should create a Ontario profile or a BC profile, different from the Canadian profile. We need to make sure that we're only creating differences when they really are needed, because it just creates challenges for vendors and implementations. So, every time we're looking at, do we need to do a profile, we need to be careful about whether we need to do it or not.
And whether it's needed, okay.
Yeah, these kinds of concerns. So one of my concerns has been as well, is that I think the rationale around a lot of these decisions in terms of must support or other things tend to occur outside or as the result of creating potentially a profile, but also tend to be documented outside of that realm. You might have to go dig a little bit, or you're relying upon the knowledge and of the and constancy, if you will, in terms of participation of the community to make sure that that's carried. So
although that's required to be in the that's required to be defined in the implementation guide as part of FHIR.
Good. I wasn't
as part of FHIR methodology, because FHIR methodology doesn't define what must support means. The implementation guide needs to define it.
Okay, great. That was my concern.
So I want to just, in doing the exercise of like, what are the CA baseline requirements that are the Canadian requirements that are different from the base, and are they necessary? When we talk about, and I think, Ron, did I interpret this correctly? It's like putting it as a section in the guide, but not necessarily applying the must support flags themselves. Does that fall into this criteria?
I think so.
So, Ron, I think the challenge about putting stuff in the guide without putting flags on, if we really mean for something to be applied, we should create the appropriate computable constraints on the profile.
Yeah.
So just putting something in narrative is frankly useless.
Well, yes, got it.
If we really mean for it to be applied, it should be in the profile or structure definition so that it can be computably confirmed.
Yep, sounds
But
good.
that's consistently, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's how this group has actually behaved in the past.
I shouldn't be speaking to these things because I don't do implementation. So, but anyway, thank you very much, Lorraine. That's good.
And so, Lorraine, you said computable constraints. You didn't say must support flags. Is that intentional?
Well, I mean, must support flags are a specific example of computable constraints, right?
Yeah. And so are you saying if we want something to be applied consistently,
then it should be in the profile. It shouldn't be just in narrative.
Yeah. The reason I'm pulling it out is that, like, is the idea that there are things that we want to be able to be applied consistently that are Canadian in nature, but must support isn't our avenue of doing that.
Oh, yeah, there may be all sorts of different ways that we can apply our particular goals. Must support might not be the right one. There may be invariants that we need to define. There may be other kinds of constraints. But must support says that every implementation that claims conformance to this profile will have a computable means of supporting that information, correct?
Yeah, generically, yeah, I think that that would cover the way that
Well-
folks define theirs.
Well, so how we define must support?
So we have specific, hold on. Let me actually get it, because I think part of the reason we wanted to ensure that we built out specific behavioral tables was because we have to have our definition potentially cover a range of downstream must support usage. We wanted to make sure that we weren't oversimplifying it. So this is our current, and I'll put it into the chat as well. So we talk about base capabilities, and we provide some conditional kind of fallbacks. And then we provide expectations on what it means when something is an optional must support and what it means when something is a required must support, cardinality of min1 must support. And so, you know, we've had to be, sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that Thomas has pointed out a bit in the past is that there's some proposals in HL7 to make these definitions more nuanced around adjusting them based on roles.
Yeah, basically forgoing must support entirely in decision to move to a different mechanism.
Yes, and dealing with based on your role, this is the expectations of the role. So we may not want to muck with what we have too much as we see how that develops. I don't know. I mean, Thomas was the one that presented that. I don't know if he has a thought or a comment there.
See, let me see.
Is he here?
He is on the call, yeah.
Sorry, just a multitask. I'm very busy recently. Anyway, must support, just my understanding, just personal opinion, and they share with the audience here. Must support normally need to be identified at the last use case based FHIR profiling document, and then also based on the must support, we see the general rule. Actually, just how to say it. It's implementable optional. So it might be more easier to understand if we really provide some pseudocode to demonstrate how must support those data elements will be handled, especially from the sender side, because sender side, actually, as of my understanding, is the only option, is only row that can be conformed. And from the receiver side, actually, based on the concept, sends more in conservative ways, receive in a more liberal way. From the receiver side, we'll take all those elements, no matter will be recognized or not. I mean, there's a risk there always. Anyway, to go through the parser, go to the parsing engine, and then leave those decisions behind the parsing engine to the next step beyond the scope of health information exchange, the mechanism that the scope here actually outside scope of the FHIR. That's one. My understanding is more popular or more feasible way. Another way, just like to consider that storage or next process, those scenario being into the scope of FHIR. if there's nothing in the must support, you put some kind of a value code inside and reinform the receiver side, and then they just put inside and then fire out to outside scope of FHIR and for any other further process. So the must support quite a lot of discussion, but down the road for actual implementation, we need to give some option tangible for the developer, especially coders. They can really code inside that their application development process, though, so that the product itself being rendered or complete been built can really handle the must support in the right way.
For the full nuance, yeah. And I think
Yes,
part of the
so Thomas, I'm gonna niggle with your comment a little bit, because my understanding the definition of must support is not that it's not that it's optional to implement. It's that you must actually be able to read and understand that element and do something with it.
Yeah.
Now the bit about do something with it is not really well defined, but it's not an optional thing. You must be able to write code to handle it. So the question is, at a given profile level, do we wish to force implementers to write code to do something with something
at the baseline.
at the base
Yeah.
Baseline spec? Further up at more specific implementation guides, yes, must supports get way more important. But if we're talking about the baseline, it's, do we think that all of the applications that are interacting with this profile need to write code to deal with this?
If I'm allowed.
Sure, go ahead,
I want
Thomas.
to clarify that actually must support what I'm talking about just for the use case oriented implementation guide, that stage. Regarding baseline or whatever, call neutral, agnostic, those only must support will show up, definitely will be my scenario, my thought of the case just to comply with any regulation policy requirements from that point. If that's the case, and all those details about must support need to be nailed down on the document, say this is a regulation requirement, you have to provide those information. But however, with exception, because there's a transition period time, you might not be available with those specific element. In that case, we treat as must support. With those situations, and it always go to policy, business requirements, all those how the lines and the codes, lines and the requirement need to be figured out before the implementation being sent out to the developer, the coder to implement, and all those details how to code it. Those protocols or process detail need to be identified without any ambiguous, alternative interpretation. That's my understanding. When you talk about the coding, definitely all those coding details need to be identified. All those conditions, whatever you have 10 or 20 conditions to identify eventually if the must support will be provided at a specific data element or not. All those details need to be documented and sent to the coder in their hand so they can translate it without any ambiguous and without any problem into the code. Thank you.
Yes, but that's something that's done as a layer on top of the baseline.
Yes.
So I think, I do think the baseline piece isn't important, because when we're talking about our decisions and our assessment of this mechanism, I think it's really two-part. It's our role of the guide plus the context of what's happening in the community. And so
Correct.
What my question is, so we know that it's likely that moving away from must support is inevitable. Do we, based on what the intent of the baseline and what we're currently dealing with, feel like it means that we should try to pursue the removal of the actual flag sooner, or do we delay it? Because I think those were the two questions that you had, Lorraine, because some of the other national, guide authors have pulled me aside and they said, I see you've got lots of must supports, this is going to come to burn you sometime soon. I think there's a decision that we have to make about whether or not we kind of keep pursuing this path until it's all been worked out and deal with the consequences of what we've built in the meantime, or make the change and figure out some other means of trying to build consistency without anchoring ourselves to, you know,
Yeah,
something what will
so
not
I
change.
wasn't involved in the conversations where we decided to apply the must supports. So
Yeah.
I don't know the rationale for making those decisions, but I do think that we might want to review our decisions, because I think we need to be careful about when we say must support in the baseline.
The last comment here, Sheridan, I think you might know the all details already, since this the end of a new the end of this cycle of how to see this discussion, the waiting for the new, you know, how to see that the year comes, which is as a revitalization of this community. So I think this might not really have a really some significant value to do the mass support based review work on the baseline so far, because normally we know this FHIR should support source build on top of all those data model, just like US did and all other, you know, projects did it or doing it right now. But due to different circumstances, definitely a FHIR baseline be built on top on itself, no any concrete data set being relied on to work on this FHIR baseline so far. But anyway, but my understanding, just like put this passport discussion aside and put some principle there. If there's no any policy or regulation requirements for the mass support, we can treat it, the mass support should be removed from baseline. That's my understanding, my personal opinion here. And from baseline perspective, just give it this very general, or maybe the other, you know, conditions should be applied. You think maybe from business perspective, from policy perspective, we need to be really stay. Because beyond that, mass support, this tag need to be removed, and then just be ready for the new, how to see, new era comes. Thank you.
So how do we get to a decision on, yep, that makes sense, let's remove them, maybe call out the things that used to be must support, but remove them as flags, or not? Is it like a vote in our governance stream and in our profiling stream? Is it putting it out to the forum? Like, how do we get to an answer about what, because Thomas, I hear what you're kind of pitching, which is remove them, given what we know is coming. How do we make that decision as a group, both from a governance and profiling perspective?
So I've asked that question before. Is how are sorry, I'm trying to enunciate, decisions made? And we don't have a decision-making framework because we don't have actually governance structure. So I don't think we actually have an answer to that question, Sharon, as much as I wish we did.
Well, I think I'm answering what should be the answer. Like, because our governance to date, while organic, is structured by the decisions that are made in our streams. And
Yeah.
when we have to make a decision, we bring it to the streams to vote and to
Well, we don't actually, even in the streams, we don't vote.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I'm stirring the pot because
No, you're
it's-
right. We don't do like official abstentions versus, like, we don't do official counts, but we do consensus with the ability for folks to continue the conversation until concerns are resolved.
Yeah, so we have a discussion and we come to a conclusion based on the people that are in the conversation at the time. But the question is, how do we come to an official conclusion? We don't have a way to come to an official conclusion. We make decisions and we do things and we actually make changes, because we've made changes, for instance, in the practitioner role based on some of the things BC brought forward. but we actually don't really have a formal way to approve changes.
Other than the asks for, like, are we okay to move
No.
forward with this as the action item?
Well, yeah,
And-
but that's not formal.
So what would you
nothing about-
recommend for this particular decision? Like, throw something out there and then we can determine whether or not for engaging the folks both offline, online on the calls for governance and profiling, what seems like a reasonable bar for where we're at for this decision?
So given that we have no other formal governance structure, and Ron can, you know, hit me if I'm screwed up about this. I think that what's probably reasonable, given what we've got, is to send a note to the forums saying this is the decision we plan to make. And we will make the decision by date X. And if you have feedback or comments, submit them before date X. And then, right?
On the forums you're thinking, or forums and calls
Forums and what?
and the calls?
Sure. The calls, the calls are an add-on. I don't know, Ron, what do you think about that?
Sorry, just coming off mute. Yeah, so here's the thing. In the absence of higher order governance, the group can do several things, and these things are all very aligned with SDO acknowledged and expected and accepted process. One is transparency in terms of any kind of decision making that's going to be formative, that will be definitional and formative. Providing an opportunity and an awareness to people that such a decision is going to be made by the community, such as it is. Providing an opportunity, so that's one thing, is transparent. Next one is providing access for feedback, and then addressing that feedback in an appropriate manner. Typically, if it's substantial in writing, and that could be online, by the way, it can be an email or whatever, but just something that's documented. And then thirdly, minuting the decision in a place that can be publicly seen.
Yes. So we could do it verbally on a call if we let people know ahead of time.
Yeah.
But if we didn't,
Yeah.
then sending a note out to the forum, letting people know ahead of time, saying, this is the topic, please weigh in, and this is where the decision will be made, I think covers those criteria.
Oh,
Other than
or do we approach it more like balloting, and all of these decisions are made within the work team, the task force that's developing it, by the people who are present, and then at some point we take it outside and say, here's what we've come up with. Give it an up or down vote, or give us your feedback, and it's at that point that we officially get the community's input, rather than looking for community, rather than voting on every single change.
Yeah, we can do it in groups, but something that's major.
Yeah, I think where that's really where we need to end up, but that is a more substantive effort. And at this time, I think, and I don't oppose that at all, by the way, I think that's a good idea, but it just depends upon how much overhead you can take. But the key thing there is that, you have the transparency, you have the opportunity, and you have the ability to respond and adapt. The only other thing, one of the things that HL7 itself does for its working groups, which I really like, is each work group is responsible for taking a template for decision-making practices and adapting it as necessary, given the nature of their community, maybe the number of co-chairs, things like that, in terms of the decision-making, that is also formalized and published so that people know when decisions are being made, they have access to a resource that says, and this is how we make our decisions. This is starting to get more formal, certainly, than you've been all along, but these are some of the virtuous aspects, if you will, of being able to do things authoritatively.
And so when we look at this, like, does this reflect, I think, a good balance of, I think we hit all the points. But if we're putting it against this example of, okay, we want to make this must support, just like propose this change in the near future, does it seem reasonable to folks?
So this might be overkill for a point change on a single element. But if we're proposing a change in direction in general, I think it's reasonable.
Yeah. Which, I mean, right now, what we're talking about is like basically removal of the must supports as a mechanism, like a formal mechanism, which seems pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone disagree with like either an item that's here or the depth for this type of decision that we should be going into with our steps? Okay. Do we think that this is, if I'm looking out, if we are going to be alerting the forum soon, do we need one more call to weigh the pros and cons before coming up to, are we saying we should remove or not remove? Or are we feeling good about, I think I've only heard cases for remove so far, putting that forward to the forum and making a decision on the dates that we would communicate. I'll zoom in so you actually can see. How much time do we need to give people ahead of time to know that this is going to be communicated on a call and they need to provide feedback by X date? Like a 2-week period?
I think 2 weeks slots.
I think 2 weeks is lots. Yeah. A week's not enough, but 2 weeks is good.
Unless we hit like a weird time in holiday season and things, but
Okay.
And
So-
by 2 weeks, that's like, so after this meeting, something goes out, and then, in the meeting in 2 weeks from now, we can take the results. It's not like a solid 24 hours times 14, which would put, acting on it 3 weeks out.
yes. And Elliot, likely, to be frank about the reality, we won't get a response.
No, yeah.
But it means that people have had a chance to respond.
Yeah. Yes.
So does it,
That's why I was saying, let's not make it a strict 2 weeks and delay it for, because we're not likely to have anybody anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
so like it's, if we, let me just play this back. So if it's 2 weeks before we formalize on a decision, if we talk about, because I do think we need to engage the profiling stream because we do capture folks that are on the profiling stream that don't come to the governance. Do we announce it after this call, discuss it on the 2nd, allow people a full week after the 2nd discussion, and then the decision, like feedback needs to be in by the 9th?
Yes, I think that's perfect.
Okay.
Are you going to be on the call on the 9th, Sheridan?
I'm not, but if we're supposed to be getting feedback up until the 9th, I think the idea is that this is a collection period, right?
And we don't have to do it that fast if we don't want to. Right? It's just
Yeah.
that just gives people some time.
Yeah, what if we get no response? So should we push then in that case 1 more week or no feedback is good feedback? Or?
No feedback within the declared time period is no feedback.
Okay, so means move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the only thing I would say, Joni, if you're concerned about, like, if the idea is this is when we'll collect the feedback, and if we hear yay or nay, this is when we'll disposition it. Like, I know Mike is going to be on the call and he'll be able to help facilitate. Like, but I know if you want to be engaged in the, if we think, part of this, the problem is like, if we think we're gonna have to like consume and make a decision because it's a mixed group of feedback, then that's one thing. And we probably should push it out.
Well, based on the feedback we have by the 9th, we can decide how to handle it.
Doesn't mean we have to action it
That's
on.
true. On the
Yeah.
9th, yeah.
Yeah, I suspect we're not going to get any response, but
So discussed on the 2nd, feedback before the 9th, discussion on how we handle it on the 9th, decision late after.
yeah,
The key here is that even without response, you have provided every opportunity to do so. And it's a predictable, understood pattern. And hence, when you make that a decision, it becomes authoritative, right? Because you've satisfied all the tenets of appropriate due diligence for these kinds of decisions.
Okay. And is there anyone who would like wants to volunteer to co-facilitate with Mike on the 9th to go through the feedback that we've received from the forum? Well, the majority of folks here today, I know Joni and I have regrets on that call, but will you folks be able to kind of go through anything that comes up either on the call or that's been posted to the forum?
I don't think it's going to be a challenge
Yeah.
because I don't think there's going to be a lot.
Okay. All right. And then I think that this is a good place and like for us, especially to see how this works. This is a major change for us that we've talked about. We'll get to talk about it a little bit more from a pros and cons perspective next Friday. But I think this is a step in the right direction.
And we'll see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll adjust.
Yeah. Okay. And I apologize. I'm glad that I know we said we'd save the 20 minutes, but I am glad that we got through this because I think this is where we needed
Sorry,
to be.
I wasn't watching the
It's
time. I
okay.
said it. Yeah.
So like, does it make sense then? We'll post the forum to cover this potentially for our next agenda item. And then I just want to confirm, this is the governance. I'm just pulling it up from the forum so we can circulate it on the chat. Is it this link that you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so this came from here, which provides the recordings as well. I'm going to put it in the Zoom so folks can review. And it's specifically the governance one, which is going to be the second link. So as a next agenda item, in addition to discussing the any results out of the feedback, we'll go through and talk about, I think we said it's where we see ourselves kind of on this and providing feedback on like how we can contribute and how we do see ourselves.
Correct.
All right, let me get that saved.
And I'm anticipating having the finalized version or a link to the finalized version of the roadmap next week.
Okay, this would be like the
roadmap.
presentation.
Yeah.
The whole roadmap.
Whole
So the
roadmap.
whole roadmap document or the presentation, or what do you mean by that, Joni?
Well, the finalized version of the roadmap, it had gone out to translation, and I'm anticipating being able to post the link to that next week.
Yes, but you mean the document, the presentation, the org chart, which?
The document.
Okay, thank you. That's good clarity.
Yeah.
So this is going to be the June 9th. Okay, perfect. Anything else? So we've got basically a pretty full, it's going to be a future agenda item for profiling. So next week we'll talk about the must support and go over, I think, a couple of the other items that we have in our community issue log. And then June 9th is going to be a big meeting. There's also
And Lorraine, Sorry, that came out a little sharper than I intended. When I responded before.
Sorry, I didn't notice, so it's okay.
Okay, well, my apologies anyhow.
All right, beautiful. Perfect. And then Mukesh, thank you again. I think I'll save this. It'll be in the recording and then also the deck if there are things that you wanted to take out of the actual slide deck for just the handful of bullets. I'll post the announcement about the must support piece, so you don't have to worry about that. It's mostly just this is what we discussed and the decision that we came to specifically around our process for how we will make the must support modeling change decision.
Just a quick housekeeping question. I now know where the recordings for this call are. Are recordings for things like the quarterly FHIR's implementers call in the same place, or are they somewhere else?
They're not in the same place. I don't have the answer to where Mike and your own, I don't know if they have an own cloud through InfoWay.
Well, I know that the Zoom said it was recording.
Yes.
It was recording. Mike was having a hard time loading it. I had suggested that he put it up to like a private YouTube channel, and then you can actually share the link to it through Info Central. But I hadn't heard back from him yet.
Okay, because I had to drop off in the last bit of the call, so I was going to go back and hear the last bit after I dropped off.
Yeah. I can reach out to Mike again and see where he's at with that.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure where to look for it.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, Joni, like I know we set up ours for the CA baseline content. Like we've only run into like weirdness once or twice, but like there is a limit eventually to how much storage we have.
Well,
right?
if we run into weirdness again, what I would probably suggest is that we create a private YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Load it to the YouTube channel, and then the videos tab in Info Central, you can add a new video to the videos tab.
Got it. Okay, so you don't have to, yeah, because like we always knew that there would be a point where we had to consider like, do we archive? Do we move away from this? Because, you know, having 25, 50 recordings every year is, I think will start to eat into.
But it may be worthwhile to create like a private YouTube channel for, you know, the CA baseline work. Private people can't search and find it.
Yeah.
But then you just add the videos to the videos tab on Info Central.
Okay, maybe that's
and potentially you add links from the meeting sessions, etc.
Sorry, what was that, Lorraine?
Well, potentially you add a link from in the forums to say, you know, this is where
the recording has been posted.
Yeah,
and then you can link to it from there too.
Okay. Well, I'll just put it as a future agenda item that we can talk through the process. Hopefully Mike will have tried it for FHIR implementers by then. So we'll have a walkthrough of what it all means, and we can talk about when we want to make the shift for our recordings in the future. Beautiful. All right. I will stop the recording and start getting these loaded.